I married a man I did not love to escape a truth I could not speak. The judge's ring was cold when he slipped it onto my finger, and I remember thinking that coldness would be my companion now, the price I paid for silence. My name is Eleanor Ashford, though I suppose I should say Eleanor Corwin now, for the name change was the entire purpose of this arrangement. I was 24 years old when I became a wife for the second time, though no one knew about the first. That was the secret I carried, the weight that pressed against my chest every morning when I woke and every night when I tried to sleep. That was what I had married to bury. 3 months ago, I stood in the parlor of my family's townhouse in Belgravia and listened to my mother weep behind closed doors while my father paced the length of his study, his footsteps heavy with shame. The scandal had not yet broken publicly, but it hovered over us like smoke seeping through the cracks of our carefully maintained respectability. One word in the right ear, one whisper at the right dinner party, and we would be ruined. Not just me. All of us. My mother would lose her place in society. The calling cards would stop arriving. The invitations would dry up like autumn leaves. My sister Catherine would find herself unmarriageable, tainted by association with something she knew nothing about. And my father, who had built his import business on reputation and trust, would watch his clients turn away one by one until there was nothing left but empty warehouses and unpaid debts. I had been careless. That was what my father said, his voice sharp as glass, his face pale with barely contained fury. Careless with my reputation, careless with my heart, careless with the fragile architecture of our family's standing. He stood before me in that parlor, his hands clasped behind his back as if to keep himself from striking me, and told me I had been a fool. Worse than a fool, a disgrace. He did not ask me what had truly happened, did not want to hear my explanation or my justification. He did not want to know. What mattered was that the evidence existed, that someone held it, that it could be produced at any moment to destroy us. What mattered was that we had to act quickly, decisively, before it could be used. The evidence was a marriage certificate, my marriage certificate, dated 18 months earlier, signed in a registry office in Dover, witnessed by strangers. The groom's name was written in careful script, the ink now faded, but still legible. I had thought the document lost, burned, destroyed. I had been wrong. The solution arrived in the form of Judge Nathaniel Corwin. He was a widower, 42 years old, respected throughout London for his fairness and his intellect. They said he never showed favor, never bent under pressure, never allowed sentiment to cloud his judgment. He had no children, no scandal attached to his name, and a reputation so immaculate it was almost oppressive. Men spoke of him with a mixture of respect and unease, as though he were not quite human, not quite capable of ordinary error or weakness. He was also desperately lonely, though he would never have admitted it. His wife had died 4 years earlier, and since then he had withdrawn into his work, into the cold machinery of the law, until people began to whisper that he had become more stone than man, that he slept in his chambers at the courthouse more often than in his own bed, that he had not attended a social gathering in 2 years, that he was brilliant but broken, untouchable but pitiable. My father approached him at his club, the Reform on Pall Mall, where men of influence gathered to smoke cigars and discuss politics over brandy. I do not know what words were exchanged, what bargain was struck, what appeal my father made to Nathaniel's sense of duty or propriety or simple human need. But within a week, Nathaniel Corwin called at our home and requested a private audience with me. I remember the way the butler announced him, his voice formal and slightly awed, as if royalty had arrived. I remember smoothing my skirts and checking my reflection in the hall mirror before entering the drawing room, knowing that everything depended on this meeting, on my ability to appear suitable, respectable, untainted. He stood by the window when I entered, his back to the room, his hands clasped behind him. He was tall and lean, dressed in somber black as if in perpetual mourning, his hair dark with threads of silver at the temples. When he turned to face me, I saw a man whose features might have been handsome once, but had been carved into severity by years of denying himself softness. His gray eyes measured me, assessing, calculating. He did not smile. He did not offer false warmth or pretty compliments. He simply gestured for me to sit, and then took the chair across from mine, maintaining a careful distance, and laid out the terms as if we were negotiating a contract. He needed a wife. The whispers about his isolation were becoming a liability, questions about his state of mind, about whether a man so removed from human connection could still render fair judgment. There had been an article in one of the legal journals, veiled but unmistakable, questioning whether personal grief had clouded his recent rulings. Colleagues had expressed concern. Superiors had suggested delicately that perhaps he should consider remarrying for the sake of his career, if nothing else. A wife would quiet those whispers, restore the appearance of normalcy, provide the social armor he needed to continue his work unquestioned. In return, he would give me his name, his protection, his considerable social standing, and most importantly, his discretion. He would not ask questions about my past. He would not pry into matters that did not concern him. He would expect respect, decorum, and the performance of wifely duties in public, the ability to appear together at necessary functions without embarrassment or scandal. What happened in private, he said in a voice devoid of inflection, would be our own affair. We would occupy separate rooms. He would make no demands upon me beyond what propriety required. We would be married in name and law, but nothing more. I agreed. What choice did I have? The alternative was ruin, not just for me, but for my younger sister Catherine, who was only 17 and deserved a future unburdened by my mistakes. Catherine, with her sweet smile and her talent for watercolors, who still believed in romance and happy endings, who had no idea what darkness I was protecting her from. So I became Mrs. Corwin in a small ceremony attended by close family and a handful of colleagues from the judiciary. It was held in a chapel off Hanover Square, the interior dim and smelling of beeswax and old hymn books, rain pattering against the stained glass windows. I wore ivory silk that had belonged to my mother, altered to fit me, and carried white roses that trembled in my hands. When Nathaniel placed the ring on my finger, his hand was steady and cool, his voice clear as he spoke the vows. Mine trembled. My voice caught on the words, and I saw something flicker in his eyes, concern perhaps, or simply impatience, before his expression smoothed back into careful neutrality. When the vicar pronounced us man and wife, Nathaniel kissed my cheek, briefly, formally, and I felt nothing but the cold press of his lips and the weight of what I had done. We moved into his house on Grosvenor Square the same day. It was a grand house, built of pale Portland stone with tall windows that overlooked the square's iron-fenced garden where nannies walked their charges in good weather and fog settled thick on gray afternoons. Inside, it was meticulously ordered. Every room arranged with the precision of a man who controlled his environment as thoroughly as he controlled a courtroom. Dark walnut paneling, heavy burgundy curtains that blocked out much of the light, shelves lined with legal volumes and philosophical texts, marble fireplaces that looked as though they were rarely lit. The furniture was expensive but austere, chosen for function rather than beauty, and there was a stillness to the place that felt almost sacred, like a library or a church. There were no photographs, no personal mementos, nothing that spoke of warmth or memory or a life lived outside the rigid boundaries of duty. His late wife's belongings had been removed years ago, he told me as he showed me through the ground floor rooms, donated to charity or given to her family. He saw no reason to dwell on the past, he said, and I wondered if that was a warning or a promise. My rooms were on the second floor, at the front of the house overlooking the square, connected to his chambers by a shared sitting room that we both understood would remain largely unused. He showed me through them with the same detached courtesy he might have shown a visiting colleague, opening doors and gesturing at furnishings as if conducting a tour of a property for sale. The bedroom was large and beautifully appointed, with a canopied bed dressed in pale blue silk, a dressing table with a silver-backed mirror, and a writing desk positioned near the window where I could watch the street below. The walls were papered in soft green with a pattern of trailing vines, the only concession to femininity in the entire house, and I learned later that these rooms had been prepared by Nathaniel's housekeeper, based on her own assumptions about what a new bride might prefer. Nathaniel himself had not given the matter any thought. He told me I could redecorate if I wished, that he had no preference for such matters, that I should consider this space entirely my own. Then he left me alone to unpack my trunks, closing the door quietly behind him, and I heard his footsteps retreat down the hallway toward his own chambers. That first night, I sat at the window in my nightdress and looked out at the darkening square, watching the gas lamps flicker to life one by one, their yellow glow pushing back against the gathering dark. Below, a carriage rolled past, its wheels clattering on the cobblestones, and somewhere in the distance a church bell tolled the hour. I felt hollowed out, emptied of everything except the relief of knowing the scandal would not break, that my family was safe, that the evidence would remain hidden. But beneath the relief was something colder, heavier. Fear, perhaps, or simply the recognition that I had traded one kind of imprisonment for another. I had escaped the consequences of my past only to lock myself into a future just as confining, just as lonely. I was a wife without a husband, a woman without a home, a ghost haunting rooms that would never truly be mine. Nathaniel did not come to my room that night, nor the next, nor the one after. He kept his distance, and I kept mine. We met at breakfast and dinner, exchanged polite conversation about the weather or the news, and then retreated to our separate lives. He spent long hours at the courthouse or in his study, poring over case files and legal briefs. I occupied myself with household matters, though the staff required little supervision, and I often found myself with nothing to do but read or walk in the square's garden, wrapped in my coat against the November chill. London in late autumn was a city of fog and shadows, the air thick with coal smoke and the smell of damp stone. I had always loved the city, loved its noise and motion, but now it felt different, as though I were seeing it through glass. I was safe, yes, respectable. But I was also invisible, a wife in name only, living in a house that felt more like a mausoleum than a home. It was 3 weeks into our marriage when I first saw the humanity beneath Nathaniel's cold exterior. We were at dinner in the formal dining room, seated at opposite ends of a table far too long for 2 people, the space between us filled with silver candlesticks and crystal that caught the flickering light. He had been quieter than usual that evening, his attention drifting to the rain against the tall windows, his food barely touched. The housekeeper, Mrs. Davies, had prepared roasted pheasant with root vegetables, but he pushed the meat around his plate without eating, his expression distant. I asked him if something was troubling him, more out of politeness than genuine concern. The question, automatic after 3 weeks of learning the rhythms of our stilted conversations. He looked at me for a long moment, and I saw something shift in his expression, a flicker of uncertainty, of vulnerability that he quickly suppressed, his jaw tightening as if he regretted showing even that much. "There was a case," he said finally, his voice low. "A young woman accused of theft from the household where she worked as a lady's maid. She had been found with a diamond brooch in her possession, a piece belonging to her mistress, and the evidence was damning. The mistress had testified. The butler had corroborated. The girl claimed she had been told to retrieve the brooch from a drawer, that she was bringing it to her mistress as requested. But no one believed her. Why would a maid be entrusted with such a task? Why would she not simply summon her mistress to the jewelry box? The defense was weak, implausible, and yet something about the testimony did not sit well with him. He suspected coercion, perhaps blackmail, some deeper story the girl was too frightened to tell. He had seen the way she looked at the butler during his testimony, the fear in her eyes. He had noted the mistress's eagerness to press charges, her insistence on the harshest possible sentence. But suspicion was not evidence. The law required him to rule based on facts, not intuition, and the facts pointed to guilt. I asked him what he would do. He said he would follow the law, of course. That was his duty. His voice was tight when he said it, controlled, and I understood then that the coldness I had perceived in him was not indifference, but something else entirely. It was control, a deliberate suppression of feeling in order to function in a world that demanded impartiality. He carried the weight of other people's lives, other people's suffering, made decisions that could destroy or save, and he could not afford to let emotion break him or bias him. He had built walls around himself not because he did not feel, but because he felt too much, and those walls were the only thing keeping him upright. For the first time, I felt something other than fear or resignation toward him. I felt pity, and perhaps the beginning of understanding, perhaps even the faint stirring of respect. The next morning, a constable arrived at the house with urgent news. It was just past 9, and Nathaniel and I were at breakfast in the morning room, a smaller, brighter space at the back of the house where sunlight, when it managed to break through London's perpetual grey, fell across the table in pale squares. I was reading a letter from my sister when Mrs. Davies entered and announced that a police constable wished to speak with the judge on a matter of some urgency. Nathaniel set down his newspaper, folded it precisely, and told her to show the man in. The constable was young, perhaps 25, with a nervous energy that made him shift from foot to foot as he delivered his report. There had been a murder in Cheapside, in the offices of a solicitor named Thomas Ridley. The body had been discovered early that morning by a clerk arriving to open the premises. Ridley had been stabbed multiple times, the attack brutal and frenzied, and left among scattered papers and overturned furniture. Files had been pulled from shelves, drawers ransacked, ink spilled across the floor. It appeared someone had been searching for something, though what remained unclear. The police believed it was connected to Ridley's work, possibly a client or someone he had wronged in the past, someone desperate enough or angry enough to kill. Given the high-profile nature of the crime and the need for absolute impartiality in the investigation and eventual trial, Nathaniel was being asked to oversee the case once a suspect was apprehended. Nathaniel took the news without visible reaction, his face composed, unreadable. He thanked the constable, asked a few brief questions about the timing and the scene, and then dismissed the man with instructions to send any preliminary reports directly to his chambers at the courthouse. The constable left, and Nathaniel sat for a moment in silence, his hand resting on the folded newspaper, his gaze distant. Then he rose, excused himself, and retreated to his study to review whatever materials the police had already provided. I watched him go, feeling a strange unease settle over me like a cold mist. I did not know Thomas Ridley. I had never heard his name before that morning. The world of solicitors and legal practitioners was one I had no connection to, or so I told myself. But something about the constable's description, about the chaos of the crime scene, the violence of it, made my skin prickle with cold recognition. It was the kind of desperation that came from fear, from someone trying to hide something or retrieve something they could not afford to lose. I told myself it was nothing. I told myself I was being irrational, that my guilt over the past was making me see connections where none existed. But the unease would not leave me, and that afternoon, when Nathaniel left for the courthouse to meet with the investigators, I went to his study. I should not have. I knew I should not have. But I could not stop myself. The room was orderly as always, the desk clear except for a single file folder left open, papers visible inside. I approached slowly, my heart beating too fast, and looked down at the contents. The details were sparse, preliminary notes from the scene, a rough sketch of the office layout, a list of people to be questioned, and then, at the bottom, a list of items recovered from the scene and marked for examination. Documents, a pocket watch, a blood-stained letter opener, a man's signet ring, several coins, and at the very bottom of the list, written in careful script, A woman's wedding ring, gold engraved. I stared at those words until they blurred, my vision swimming, my hands gripping the edge of the desk to keep myself upright. It could be anyone's ring. It could mean nothing. Thousands of women in London wore wedding rings. But I knew, with a certainty that made my hands shake and my breath come short, that it was mine. The ring I had worn before this one, before Nathaniel, before the marriage that was supposed to erase everything. The ring I had told my father was lost, dropped somewhere on the street or in a shop, vanished as if it had never existed. The ring that proved I had been married before, to a man whose name I could not speak, whose memory I had tried to bury. I closed the file carefully, my fingers clumsy, making sure every paper was exactly as I had found it. Then I walked back to my room on legs that barely held me, my mind racing, trying to understand how this was possible, what it meant, what I should do. I sat on the edge of my bed and pressed my hands together to stop them from trembling, but they would not stop. Outside, the afternoon light was fading, the sky turning heavy and gray with the promise of rain. I thought of Nathaniel, of his gray eyes and his quiet voice, of the way he had looked at me over dinner and spoken about duty and evidence and the weight of truth. I thought of the way he had looked at me this morning over breakfast, with something that might have been concern, might have been the beginning of care. Soon, very soon, he would be examining that evidence himself. He would hold that ring in his hand, would note the engraving on the inside, would begin to ask questions about who it belonged to and how it came to be at the scene of a murder. And if someone connected it to me, if someone knew what I had done, if the truth came out, then everything I had sacrificed to protect, everyone I had tried to save, would be destroyed. I had married Nathaniel Corwin to bury a scandal. But the scandal had found me anyway, dug up from the grave I thought I had sealed, and now it lay waiting in an evidence box in a courthouse, ready to be opened, ready to reveal everything. The rain began to fall, soft at first, then harder, drumming against the windows like fingertips demanding entry, like the past demanding to be let in. The evidence box arrived at the house 3 days later. I watched from the drawing room window as 2 constables carried it up the steps, a wooden crate reinforced with metal corners, sealed with official stamps and locked with a heavy padlock. Nathaniel met them at the door, signed for it, and had it brought directly to his study. I heard the door close, heard the lock turn, and felt my throat tighten until I could barely breathe. He spent the entire afternoon in that room. I tried to occupy myself with correspondence, with needlework, with reading, but I could not concentrate on anything except the knowledge of what lay inside that box. The ring, my ring, and possibly other things, other evidence that might connect me to Thomas Ridley, to that office in Cheapside, to the violence that had ended his life. I had not killed him. I needed to believe that, needed to hold on to that truth. But I had been there, not on the night of his death, but before, months before, and I had left something behind. Nathaniel emerged at 6:30, his face drawn with fatigue, his eyes shadowed. He found me in the drawing room, sitting by the fire with a book I had not read a single word of, and told me he would not be dining at home that evening. He had a meeting with the chief inspector at Scotland Yard, a review of the preliminary findings. He apologized for the short notice, his voice formal, distant, and I told him it was quite all right, that I understood his work took precedence. He studied me for a moment, and I wondered if he could see the fear in my eyes, the tension in my shoulders. But he only nodded, collected his coat and hat, and left. The moment the front door closed, I went to his study. The door was still locked. I stood outside it for a long time, my hand resting on the brass handle, knowing I should not, knowing it was madness. But the need to know was stronger than reason. I went to the library and found the spare key Mrs. Davies kept in the desk drawer, returned to the study, and unlocked the door with hands that shook so badly I nearly dropped the key. The evidence box sat on Nathaniel's desk, open now, the lid propped against the wall. Inside were cloth bags labeled and numbered, papers in protective folders, and several small wooden trays containing objects wrapped in tissue. I approached slowly, my heart hammering, and looked inside. The letter opener, stained dark with blood. The pocket watch, its crystal face cracked. A stack of documents tied with string. And there, in one of the small trays, a ring wrapped in white cloth. I lifted it out with trembling fingers and unwrapped it. Gold, simple, engraved on the inside with initials and a date. My initials, the date of my first wedding. I stood there holding it, feeling the weight of it, the terrible familiarity, and for a moment, I was back in Dover, 18 months ago, standing in a registry office with a man I thought I loved, a man I thought would save me from the constraints of my life. I had been so young, so foolish, so desperate to believe in something beyond the suffocating expectations of society. His name had been James Whitmore. He was a clerk in a solicitor's office, handsome and charming and utterly unsuitable. We had met at a garden party, a chance encounter that became a secret correspondence, letters hidden and burned, meetings arranged through careful lies. He told me he loved me, that he would find a way for us to be together despite the difference in our stations. And I, naive and romantic, believed him. We eloped to Dover on a rainy afternoon, married by a registrar who barely looked at us, witnessed by strangers who signed the certificate for a few coins. James slipped this ring onto my finger and kissed me, and I thought I had never been happier. The happiness lasted 3 weeks. That was how long it took for me to discover that James Whitmore was not a clerk, but a con artist, that he had debts all over London, that he had married me for my family's money and connections. When I confronted him, he laughed. He told me I had been easy to deceive, that girls like me always were, desperate for adventure and willing to throw away everything for a pretty face and kind words. He said he would go to my father and demand payment to keep the marriage secret, enough to clear his debts and set him up comfortably. If my father refused, he would make the marriage public. Ruin me, ruin my family. I told him no. I told him I would go to the police, would report him for fraud, would expose everything he had done. He struck me across the face, hard enough that I fell. Then he left, taking the marriage certificate with him, and I did not see him again. I spent weeks trying to find him, trying to get the certificate back, but he had vanished. And then my father discovered what I had done, discovered the marriage through one of James's associates who tried to extort money. My father paid him off, bought his silence, and began searching for a way to bury the scandal before it destroyed us all. That was when Nathaniel Corwin entered my life, and that was when I thought the past was finally buried. But James Whitmore had gone to Thomas Ridley. Of course he had. Ridley was the kind of solicitor who specialized in delicate matters, blackmail, extortion, documents that needed to be hidden or produced at the right moment for the right price. James must have given him the marriage certificate for safekeeping, insurance against the day he needed it. And now Ridley was dead, his office ransacked, and my ring had been found among the evidence. I stood in Nathaniel's study, holding that ring, and felt the walls closing in. Someone had killed Thomas Ridley, possibly searching for documents he held. Had they found the marriage certificate? Was it still in his office somewhere, overlooked by the police? Or had the killer taken it? And if so, who was the killer? James. Someone else with secrets to protect? Someone who knew what I had done? I wrapped the ring back in its cloth, placed it carefully in the tray, and closed the evidence box. I relocked the study door, returned the key, and went upstairs to my room. I sat in the darkness by the window and watched the street below, the gas lamps flickering, the occasional carriage passing. I thought about running, about taking what little money I had and disappearing before Nathaniel discovered the truth. But where would I go? And what would happen to my family if I fled? The scandal would break anyway, perhaps worse than before. I thought about telling Nathaniel everything, about going to him when he returned and confessing the whole sordid story, throwing myself on his mercy. But what mercy could I expect from a judge whose entire life was built on law and truth? He had married me believing I was respectable, unburdened by scandal. What would he do when he learned I had lied to him, had brought danger and disgrace into his house? I must have fallen asleep in the chair because I woke to the sound of the front door opening, footsteps in the hall below. Nathaniel, returning from his meeting. I heard him speak briefly to Mrs. Davies, heard him climb the stairs, his footsteps passing my door and continuing to his own chambers. I waited, listening, and after a while the house fell silent again. The next morning at breakfast, Nathaniel told me the police had made an arrest. A man named Robert Fletcher, a former client of Thomas Ridley's who had recently been released from prison for embezzlement. Fletcher had been seen near Ridley's office on the night of the murder, and witnesses reported hearing them arguing days earlier. Fletcher claimed innocence, said he had only been trying to retrieve documents that proved he had been wrongly convicted, documents Ridley had refused to release. But the evidence was damning. His fingerprints were on the door. He had no alibi, and he had a clear motive. Nathaniel told me this in his usual measured tone, spreading marmalade on his toast, his expression thoughtful. The trial would begin in 2 weeks, he said. It would be a significant case, closely watched by the press and the public. He would need to be meticulous in his preparations, careful in his rulings. Justice must not only be done, but be seen to be done. I asked him if he believed Fletcher was guilty. He looked at me across the table, and I saw something flicker in his eyes. Uncertainty, perhaps, or caution. He said the evidence suggested guilt, but something about Fletcher's testimony troubled him. The man seemed genuinely confused, genuinely frightened, as if he did not understand what he was being accused of. But that could be an act. Criminals were often convincing liars. I felt a strange relief mixed with dread. If Fletcher had killed Ridley, then perhaps he had taken the marriage certificate, perhaps it would never surface. But if he was innocent, if someone else had committed the murder, then the real killer was still out there, still in possession of evidence that could destroy me. That afternoon, Nathaniel asked if I would accompany him to a dinner party at the home of Sir Edmund Blackwell, a senior judge and longtime colleague. It would be a small gathering, mostly legal professionals and their wives, nothing too demanding. But it was important that we be seen together, that we present a united front, a proper married couple. I agreed, of course. What else could I do? The dinner was held 3 nights later at Sir Edmund's townhouse in Mayfair. I wore a gown of deep green silk with black lace at the collar and cuffs, appropriate for a judge's wife, elegant but not ostentatious. Nathaniel helped me with my cloak, his hands gentle on my shoulders, and for a moment I felt something unexpected. Gratitude, perhaps, or the ghost of what trust might feel like if I had not built our marriage on lies. The dinner was exactly as he had described. 12 guests seated around a long table, the conversation dominated by talk of recent cases, legal reforms, parliamentary debates. The wives listened politely and spoke of charity work, of the season's social calendar, of children and households. I played my part, smiled at the appropriate moments, made bland observations about the weather and the latest exhibition at the Royal Academy. No one suspected that beneath my composure, I was drowning. It was during the dessert course that I heard her name. Lady Pemberton, seated across from me, was speaking to the woman beside her about a scandal involving a merchant's daughter who had eloped with a fortune hunter. The girl had been found and brought back, but the damage was done. No respectable family would receive her now. Such a shame, Lady Pemberton said, when young girls throw away everything for a moment's foolishness. They never think of the consequences, never consider what they are risking. I felt Nathaniel's gaze on me, steady and appraising, and when I looked up, I saw something in his eyes that made my breath catch. Not suspicion exactly, but awareness. As if a door had opened in his mind, as if he was beginning to see connections he had not seen before. I looked away quickly, lifted my wine glass, and found my hand was shaking. After dinner, the men retired to Sir Edmund's library for brandy and cigars, while the ladies gathered in the drawing room for tea and gossip. I sat near the fire, listening to their chatter wash over me, feeling separate from it all, distant. And then Lady Pemberton sat down beside me and said in a low voice that she hoped I did not mind her asking, but was I quite well? I had seemed rather pale during dinner, and she wondered if I was feeling ill. I assured her I was perfectly fine, merely tired. She patted my hand and said marriage took some adjustment, did it not, especially to a man like Judge Corwin, such a serious man, so devoted to his work. She hoped he was kind to me, that he made time for me despite his demanding schedule. I told her he was very considerate, very proper. She smiled and said that was good, that I was fortunate. Some men, she said quietly, were not kind at all, especially when they discovered their wives were not what they had believed them to be. I stared at her, my heart pounding, trying to read her expression, trying to understand if she knew something or if this was merely idle conversation. But her face was bland, pleasant, giving nothing away. She rose and rejoined the other ladies, leaving me alone by the fire with the terrible suspicion that the walls were closing in faster than I had imagined, that soon there would be nowhere left to hide. When Nathaniel and I returned home that night, he walked me to my door as he always did, wished me good night, and turned to go. But then he paused, his hand on the doorframe, and said my name. I turned back, and he looked at me with an expression I could not read. He asked if there was anything I wanted to tell him, anything troubling me. He said he had noticed I seemed distressed lately, that if there was something wrong, something he could help with, I should not hesitate to speak. I told him no, that everything was fine, that I was simply adjusting to my new life. He nodded slowly, but I could see he did not believe me. He said good night again and left, and I closed the door and leaned against it, my legs barely supporting me. He was beginning to suspect. The question was how long I had before he discovered the truth, and what I would do when that moment came. Outside, the fog had rolled in thick and cold, swallowing the street lamps, turning the world beyond my window into shapeless gray. I felt as though I were disappearing into it, becoming invisible, ceasing to exist. And part of me wished I could simply fade away and leave no trace, no evidence, no scandal to destroy the people I loved. But the ring in Nathaniel's study was real. The evidence box was real. And soon, very soon, the truth would be real too, dragged into the light where I could no longer hide from it. I only hoped that when that moment came, I would have the courage to face what I had done, and that Nathaniel, the man I had married to escape the past, would find it in himself to understand why I had lied. The trial began on a cold Monday morning in late November. I woke before dawn to the sound of rain against the windows, steady and relentless, and lay in the darkness, listening to the house wake around me. The servants moving through the lower floors, the rattle of coal being delivered to the scullery, the distant clang of the kitchen range being lit. And beneath it all, the sound of Nathaniel's footsteps in the room next to mine, pacing, methodical, the rhythm of a man preparing for battle. I dressed carefully in a gown of charcoal gray with jet buttons, severe and appropriate for a courtroom. I had decided I would attend the trial. Nathaniel had not asked me to come, had not suggested it, but I needed to be there. I needed to see Robert Fletcher, needed to hear what he would say, needed to understand if he truly was the man who had killed Thomas Ridley, or if someone else, someone with more to lose, had committed the murder and let him take the blame. When I came down to breakfast, Nathaniel was already at the table, reviewing documents, a cup of coffee growing cold at his elbow. He looked up when I entered, surprise flickering across his features before he composed himself. I told him I wished to attend the trial if he had no objection. He studied me for a long moment, his gray eyes searching my face, and I forced myself to meet his gaze without flinching. Finally, he said that, of course, I was welcome to attend, that the public gallery would be open, but he warned me the testimony might be disturbing. Murder cases often were. I assured him I understood. He nodded, returned to his papers, and we finished breakfast in silence. The courtroom was at the Old Bailey, that imposing building on the corner of Newgate Street and Old Bailey itself, where justice had been dispensed for centuries. We arrived early, Nathaniel disappearing through a side entrance while I made my way to the public gallery, a cramped balcony overlooking the courtroom below. It was already filling with spectators, journalists with notebooks, ladies whose husbands held positions of influence, the curious and the morbid, who attended trials as if they were theater. I found a seat near the front, arranged my skirts, and waited. The courtroom was all dark wood and brass, high ceilings and tall windows that let in weak gray light. The judge's bench sat elevated at the front, imposing and absolute, and I watched as Nathaniel entered and took his place there, his black robes making him look even more severe than usual, his expression one of perfect neutrality. He did not look up at the gallery. He did not acknowledge me. He was no longer my husband in that moment. He was the embodiment of the law itself, cold and impartial and beyond human feeling. Robert Fletcher was brought in shortly after, escorted by constables, his hands shackled. He was younger than I had expected, perhaps 30, thin and pale, with the look of a man who had spent too much time in confinement. His suit was shabby but clean, and he moved with the careful dignity of someone determined not to be broken by circumstance. When he took his place in the dock, he looked around the courtroom with an expression of bewildered fear, and I felt a chill run through me. This was not the face of a killer. This was the face of a man who did not understand how he had come to be here. The prosecutor was a man named Gerald Ashcroft, renowned for his ruthlessness and his conviction rate. He stood and laid out the case with brutal efficiency. Thomas Ridley, solicitor, found dead in his office on the morning of October 23rd. Stabbed 17 times. The office ransacked, files scattered, clear evidence that the killer had been searching for something. Robert Fletcher, recently released from prison, had been seen near the office that night. He had argued with Ridley 2 days before the murder, threatening him in front of witnesses. Fletcher claimed Ridley held documents proving his innocence in the embezzlement case that had sent him to prison, documents Ridley refused to release. When confronted, Fletcher had shouted that Ridley would regret his betrayal, that he would make him pay. Witnesses were called. A clerk from a neighboring office testified he had seen Fletcher outside Ridley's building near midnight. A cabman testified he had driven Fletcher to Cheapside that evening. The police inspector testified about finding Fletcher's fingerprints on the door handle, about the lack of any credible alibi. The evidence was overwhelming, each piece adding to the weight pressing down on the man in the dock. But Nathaniel, I noticed, was paying close attention to the small details, the inconsistencies. He questioned the clerk about the visibility that night, the fog, the distance from which he claimed to have recognized Fletcher. He asked the cabman about his other fares, about whether he could be certain of the exact address where he had deposited Fletcher. He pressed the inspector on the thoroughness of the search, on what else had been found in Ridley's office, on whether all the evidence had been properly catalogued. It was during the afternoon session that the evidence box was opened in court. I watched from the gallery as each item was presented, labeled, recorded. The pocket watch, the blood-stained letter opener, documents that were placed in sealed folders and not opened publicly due to their confidential nature. And then the inspector lifted out the small wooden tray containing the wedding ring. He testified that the ring had been found beneath Ridley's desk, possibly kicked there during the struggle. It was gold, engraved with initials, clearly valuable. They had attempted to trace its ownership, but had not yet succeeded. It might have belonged to a client, might have been part of a divorce case or an inheritance dispute that Ridley was handling. Or it might have been dropped by the killer, though that seemed unlikely given that it was clearly a woman's ring. Nathaniel asked to examine it. I watched as he took the ring, held it up to the light, studied the engraving. My heart was pounding so hard I thought everyone in the courtroom must hear it. He asked the inspector to read the engraving aloud for the record. The inspector did so, stating the initials and the date, and I felt the blood drain from my face. My initials, my date. Spoken aloud in a courtroom for everyone to hear. But no one reacted. No one connected it to me. No one in that room except me knew what those initials meant, what that date signified. Nathaniel set the ring back in its tray, made a note in his ledger, and moved on to the next piece of evidence. The trial adjourned for the day at 4:30. I left quickly, not waiting for Nathaniel, taking a cab home through the darkening streets. I felt sick with fear and relief, dizzy with the knowledge that I had come so close to being exposed and yet had remained invisible. But the trial was not over. There would be more days, more testimony, more examination of the evidence. And Nathaniel, I had seen the way he looked at that ring, the careful way he had noted the details. He was thinking about it, turning it over in his mind, beginning to ask questions. That evening at dinner, he asked me about my family. It seemed an innocuous question, a casual inquiry into my history, but I sensed something beneath it, a probing. He asked about my education, about what I had done before our marriage, about whether I had ever traveled outside London. I answered carefully, keeping my responses vague, steering away from any mention of Dover, of registry offices, of mistakes I had made. He listened attentively, occasionally asking a follow-up question, his expression thoughtful. When dinner ended, he excused himself to his study, and I heard the door lock behind him. I could not sleep that night. I lay in my bed, listening to the clock chime the hours, thinking about the ring in that evidence box, about Nathaniel examining it, about how long it would take before he made the connection. I had been careless leaving it there. But I had not left it there, had I? James must have given it to Ridley along with the marriage certificate, or perhaps I had lost it the day I went to Ridley's office, that terrible afternoon when I had tried to retrieve the documents myself. I had not told anyone about that visit. Not my father, not Nathaniel. It had been 3 weeks before my wedding, and I had been desperate. I knew James had gone to Ridley, knew Ridley held the marriage certificate, and I thought perhaps I could reason with him, could pay him to destroy it, could convince him that helping me was in his best interest. I had gone to his office in Cheapside, climbed the narrow stairs, knocked on his door. He had let me in, listened to my plea, and then laughed. He told me the certificate was worth far more than anything I could offer him, that he had other clients who might be interested in such information, that scandal was a commodity he traded in. I had left in tears, humiliated and terrified, and I must have lost the ring then, in that office, during that awful interview. And now it had been found, and Nathaniel was examining it, and soon, perhaps very soon, he would discover the truth. The next day, Fletcher took the stand in his own defense. He was a poor witness, nervous and inarticulate, stumbling over his words. He testified that he had been wrongly convicted of embezzlement, that his former employer had framed him to cover up his own theft, and that Thomas Ridley had been his solicitor during the trial. Ridley, he claimed, had failed to present crucial evidence that would have proven his innocence, evidence that Ridley himself had compiled. Fletcher had gone to prison, believing Ridley would work to overturn the conviction, but nothing happened. Years passed, and when Fletcher was finally released, he went to Ridley demanding an explanation, demanding the evidence that had been suppressed. Ridley, Fletcher said, had refused to see him at first. Fletcher had persisted, had confronted him on the street, had raised his voice in frustration. But he had not threatened him, not truly, and he certainly had not killed him. On the night of the murder, Fletcher had indeed gone to Cheapside, hoping to find Ridley at his office after hours, hoping to plead with him one more time. But the office was locked, dark, and Fletcher had left. He had walked along the Thames for hours, trying to think what to do next, and then he had returned to his lodgings. He had no witnesses, no alibi, only his word. The prosecutor tore him apart on cross-examination. He highlighted Fletcher's criminal record, his motive, his opportunity. He suggested Fletcher had broken into the office, had confronted Ridley, had killed him in a rage when Ridley refused to help him. He pointed to the physical evidence, the fingerprints, the timeline. Fletcher could offer nothing to refute it except his own insistence that he was innocent, that someone else must have killed Ridley, that he was being blamed for a crime he did not commit. I watched Nathaniel throughout this testimony, trying to read his expression, trying to understand what he was thinking. He was inscrutable as always, his face composed, but I saw him make several notes, saw him lean forward when Fletcher spoke about the suppressed evidence, saw something flicker in his eyes that might have been doubt. That evening, Nathaniel came to my room. It was the first time since our wedding night that he had crossed the threshold, and I felt my pulse quicken with fear. He stood in the doorway, still in his formal clothes, and asked if he might speak with me. I invited him in, and he sat in the chair by the window while I remained standing, my hands clasped in front of me. He told me he was troubled by the case. The evidence against Fletcher was substantial, but something about it felt incomplete, too convenient. Fletcher's story, as poorly as he had told it, had a ring of truth to it, or at least desperation. And Nathaniel could not shake the feeling that there was more to Ridley's death than a simple act of revenge. He had been looking into Ridley's practice, he said, examining the types of cases he handled. Ridley specialized in delicate matters, documents that needed to be held in confidence, information that could damage reputations. He had clients from all levels of society, from the wealthy to the desperate, and he profited from their secrets. That made him dangerous, and it made him a target. Nathaniel paused, looking at me with an intensity that made me want to turn away. He said that among the items recovered from Ridley's office was a ledger, a record of documents held in safekeeping. Most of the entries were vague, identified only by numbers and dates, but it was clear Ridley had been holding material for a number of clients, material they did not want discovered. The police were attempting to decode the ledger, to identify the clients, to determine if any of them might have had motive to kill Ridley. My hands were trembling. I hid them in the folds of my skirt and forced myself to remain calm, to breathe normally. I asked him if he thought Fletcher was innocent. He said he did not know, but he intended to examine the evidence more closely, to satisfy himself that justice was being served. That was his duty, he said, even if it complicated the prosecution's case. Then he stood and moved closer to me, close enough that I could see the weariness in his face, the lines around his eyes. He told me he knew I was hiding something. He had known it since our wedding, had sensed the fear beneath my composure, the secrets I carried. He had respected my privacy, because that was the agreement we had made. But now he was asking me directly if there was anything I needed to tell him, anything related to this case, anything that might help him understand what truly happened to Thomas Ridley. I could not speak. My throat had closed, my mouth gone dry. I stood there looking at him, at this man I had married to escape judgment, and I saw not coldness in his eyes, but something else, concern, perhaps even compassion. He was giving me a chance to confess, to tell him the truth before he discovered it himself. But I could not. The words would not come, because if I told him, I would lose everything. Not just my reputation, not just my marriage, but any possibility that he might see me as anything other than a liar and a fraud. And I realized in that moment that I wanted him to see me differently, wanted him to think well of me, wanted to be worthy of the protection he had offered. I told him there was nothing. My voice was barely a whisper, but I forced it out. I told him I was simply unused to the intensity of courtroom proceedings, that watching the trial had disturbed me, but that I had no connection to Thomas Ridley or his death. Nathaniel watched me in silence for a long moment. Then he nodded, though his expression suggested he did not believe me. He said good night and left, closing the door softly behind him, and I sank onto the bed and buried my face in my hands. He knew I was lying, and soon he would discover why. The question was, what he would do when that moment came, and whether anything I said or did now could prevent the inevitable destruction that was rushing toward us both. Outside, the rain continued to fall, washing the streets clean, erasing footprints and evidence, sweeping everything toward the Thames, where it would disappear into the dark water and be carried out to sea. I wished I could disappear like that, could be swept away and forgotten. But the ring remained, the evidence remained, and the truth, patient and relentless, waited to be discovered. I thought of Fletcher in his cell, awaiting judgment for a crime he might not have committed. I thought of James Whitmore, who had set all of this in motion with his greed and his lies. I thought of Thomas Ridley, dead now, his secrets scattered across his office floor. And I thought of Nathaniel, the man who had promised to protect me, who was now slowly, methodically, uncovering the very thing I had married him to hide. The trial would continue tomorrow. More testimony, more evidence, more opportunities for the truth to surface. And I would be there, sitting in the gallery, watching my husband preside over a case that could destroy me, wondering if the man I had come to admire, perhaps even to care for, would show me mercy when he finally learned what I had done, or if he would do what the law demanded and condemn me as thoroughly as any criminal in the dock below. The truth came out on the fourth day of the trial, not in the courtroom, but in Nathaniel's study, on a gray afternoon when fog pressed against the windows and the house felt like a tomb. I had not attended court that morning. I had woken with a headache that felt like iron bands around my skull, my body heavy with exhaustion from too many sleepless nights. I sent word to Nathaniel that I was unwell and would remain at home. He accepted this without comment, though when he came to check on me before leaving, I saw concern in his eyes, and something else. Suspicion, determination, the look of a man who had made a decision. After he left, I tried to rest, but sleep would not come. I lay in my darkened room listening to the sounds of the house, the ticking of the mantel clock, the rattle of carriages passing in the street below. At some point I must have dozed, because I woke to the sound of footsteps on the stairs, quick and purposeful, and then Nathaniel's voice calling my name. I rose and opened the door to find him standing in the hallway, still in his robes, his face pale and set. He asked me to come to his study immediately. Something in his tone, in the rigid way he held himself, told me this was not a request. I wrapped a shawl around my shoulders and followed him down the stairs. His study was cold, the fire unlit. The evidence box sat open on his desk, papers spread around it, and I saw immediately what he had been doing. He had been cross-referencing, comparing, investigating, and he had found something. He closed the door behind us and gestured for me to sit. I remained standing. He studied me for a long moment, and I saw in his face not anger, but something worse: disappointment, betrayal, the look of a man who had trusted and been deceived. He picked up the wedding ring from its tray, held it between his fingers, the gold catching what little light came through the window. He said he had spent the morning reviewing Ridley's ledger more carefully, looking for patterns, for connections. One entry had caught his attention, a notation about documents held for a client, stored in 18 months ago, shortly after the date engraved inside this ring. The notation included initials: E.A. Eleanor Ashford, my maiden name, my initials, connected to the ring, connected to Ridley, connected to the murder. He set the ring down carefully on the desk between us and asked me to explain. His voice was quiet, controlled, but I heard the strain beneath it, the effort it took to maintain that control. I stood there looking at him, at this man who had given me his name and his protection, and I knew I could not lie to him anymore. The time for lies had passed. I told him everything. I told him about James Whitmore, about the secret courtship and the elopement to Dover, about the registry office and the marriage that lasted 3 weeks before it fell apart. I told him about James's true nature, his debts, his threats. I told him how my father had discovered it, how we had tried to retrieve the marriage certificate, how James had gone to Thomas Ridley and placed the documents in his keeping as insurance against the day he might need them. I told him about my visit to Ridley's office 3 weeks before my wedding to Nathaniel, about my desperate attempt to convince Ridley to destroy the documents, about his refusal, his laughter, his casual cruelty. I must have lost the ring there, I said, dropped it without noticing in my distress. And then Ridley was murdered, and the ring was found, and I was terrified that someone would connect it to me, that the marriage certificate would surface, that everything I had tried to protect would be destroyed. When I finished, the silence in the room was absolute. Nathaniel stood perfectly still, his face unreadable, his hands resting on the desk. Outside, a carriage passed in the street, the sound of hooves on cobblestones muffled by the fog. The clock on the mantel ticked steadily, marking each second of my humiliation. Finally he spoke. He asked if I had killed Thomas Ridley. His voice was flat, emotionless, and I realized he was asking not as my husband, but as a judge, weighing evidence, determining guilt. The question cut deeper than any accusation. He thought me capable of murder. He thought I might have gone to Ridley's office on that October night, might have stabbed him 17 times, might have ransacked his files, searching for the documents that could destroy me. I told him no. I had not killed Ridley. I had not even known he was dead until the constable came to our house with the news. On the night of the murder, I had been here, in this house, in my room. I had no alibi beyond the word of the servants, but it was the truth. He asked if I knew who had killed him. I said I did not, but I suspected James. James knew what Ridley held, knew the value of those documents. Perhaps he had tried to retrieve them himself. Perhaps Ridley had refused or demanded payment. Perhaps things had turned violent. Or perhaps someone else, someone with secrets even darker than mine, had killed Ridley to silence him. Nathaniel walked to the window and stood with his back to me, looking out at the fog-shrouded square. He asked why I had not come to him immediately when I learned of the murder, why I had not told him about the ring, about my connection to Ridley. I could have come to him, he said, could have trusted him with the truth. Instead, I had lied, had allowed him to preside over a trial while concealing information that might be relevant to the case. I had made him complicit in my deception. I told him I was afraid of losing everything, afraid of ruining my family, afraid of what he would think of me. I had married him to bury a scandal, and I could not admit that the scandal had followed me into our marriage, into his house, into his courtroom. I had wanted to protect him from it, I said, though I knew that sounded hollow now, self-serving. He turned to face me, and I saw something break in his expression, some final wall crumbling. He said he had known I was hiding something, had sensed the fear in me from the beginning, but he had believed I would come to trust him in time, would learn that he was not a man who judged without understanding, who condemned without mercy. He had hoped, he said, and his voice cracked slightly on that word, that we might become more than strangers bound by a convenient arrangement, that we might become partners, companions, perhaps even friends. But I had not trusted him. I had treated him as the world treated him, as something cold and implacable, incapable of understanding human weakness. And that, he said quietly, hurt more than the lies. I felt tears burning in my eyes, threatening to fall. I told him I was sorry, knowing the words were inadequate, knowing they could not undo the damage I had done. I had been wrong not to trust him. I had been a coward. But I had not killed Thomas Ridley. And if he believed nothing else, I said, I needed him to believe that. He studied me for a long moment, and I saw him struggling with himself, weighing his duty against something else, something personal and painful. Finally, he said he believed me. He did not believe I was capable of murder, not because I was too virtuous, but because I was too afraid. A woman who had lived in fear of scandal her entire life would not commit an act so violent, so likely to be discovered. She would hide, would lie, would sacrifice her happiness to maintain appearances. But she would not kill. The relief I felt was overwhelming, dizzying. I reached for the desk to steady myself, and Nathaniel moved quickly to my side, his hand on my arm, supporting me. For a moment we stood like that, closer than we had been since our wedding day, and I felt the warmth of him, the solidness of him, and realized how much I had come to depend on his presence, even as I had hidden myself from him. He helped me to a chair and then returned to his desk. He said we had to determine what had happened to the marriage certificate. If it was still in Ridley's office, if the police found it during their investigation, my connection to the case would become public. If the killer had taken it, then I was at the mercy of whoever held it now. Either way, the secret I had married him to protect was no longer secure. I asked what he intended to do. He said he would continue to investigate, would examine the evidence more thoroughly, would look for any indication of who might have killed Ridley and why. But he would do so carefully, discreetly, without drawing attention to my connection to the case. He had married me offering protection, he said, and he would honor that promise, even though I had not honored our implicit agreement of honesty. I started to thank him, but he held up a hand, stopping me. He said this did not mean he had forgiven my deception, did not mean things between us would simply return to normal. I had broken his trust, and trust once broken was difficult to repair. But he would not abandon me. That was not the kind of man he was, even if he sometimes wished he could be. That evening, after he had returned to the courthouse to review more documents, I remained in his study. I looked at the evidence box, at the papers spread across his desk, at the notes he had made in his careful handwriting. And I saw something he had circled, a name in Ridley's ledger that appeared multiple times, James Whitmore, but the notations were recent, dated within the last month. James had been in contact with Ridley shortly before the murder. My hands shook as I pulled the ledger closer, reading the entries more carefully. James had visited Ridley 3 times in the weeks before the murder. The notations suggested payments made, documents requested, some kind of transaction. And then, next to the final entry dated 2 days before Ridley's death, Nathaniel had written a question mark and the word blackmail. I heard footsteps in the hall and quickly returned the ledger to its place. Mrs. Davies appeared in the doorway, asking if I would be taking dinner, and I told her no, that I was not hungry. She looked at me with something like pity and withdrew. I sat alone in Nathaniel's chair and tried to piece together what had happened. James had gone to Ridley recently, had made some arrangement, had paid money for something. What? For the return of the marriage certificate, or for something else? Had James been blackmailing someone using the information Ridley held? And if so, had that someone killed Ridley to end the blackmail? Or had James himself killed Ridley? Had things gone wrong during one of their meetings? Had Ridley refused to cooperate, demanded more money, threatened to expose James's schemes? James was capable of violence. I knew that from experience. He had struck me once. Perhaps he had struck Ridley too, and when Ridley fell, when the blood began to flow, James had panicked and finished what he started. If James was the killer, then Robert Fletcher was innocent, exactly as he claimed. An innocent man would be convicted while the guilty one walked free, and I would be responsible because I had hidden my connection to the case, had let Nathaniel preside over the trial without knowing all the facts. I could not let that happen. Whatever else I had done, whatever lies I had told, I could not let an innocent man hang because I was too afraid to speak the truth. When Nathaniel returned home near midnight, I was waiting for him in the entry hall. I told him what I had found in the ledger, told him about James's recent contact with Ridley, told him I believed James might be the killer. Nathaniel listened without interruption, his face drawn with exhaustion, and when I finished, he said he had come to a similar conclusion. He had spent the evening investigating James Whitmore, tracking down his current address, his associates, his movements in the days surrounding the murder. James had been living in a lodging house in Clerkenwell, working sporadically as a clerk, always in debt, always looking for a scheme to make money. Several of his landlords had complained about visitors at odd hours, about arguments that could be heard through the walls. And James had disappeared the day after Ridley's murder, simply vanished, leaving his room without notice, abandoning what few possessions he had. The police had not looked for him because they had no reason to connect him to the crime. But Nathaniel was looking now. He had sent inquiries to railway stations, coaching inns, ports. If James had fled London, there would be a record of it. And if he was still in the city, hiding, then Nathaniel would find him. I asked what would happen when James was found. Nathaniel said he would be questioned, and if evidence connected him to the murder, he would be charged. The trial would have to be delayed, new proceedings initiated. It would be a scandal, an embarrassment for the prosecution, for Scotland Yard, for everyone involved. But it would be just. And what of me? I asked. What of the marriage certificate? The evidence of my first marriage? If James was arrested, if his possessions were searched, would my secret be exposed anyway? Nathaniel looked at me with an expression I could not read. He said the marriage certificate might already be gone, destroyed by James or lost in whatever chaos followed the murder. Or it might still exist, hidden somewhere, waiting to surface. But if it did, he said quietly, we would face it together. He had married me for better or worse, and this apparently was the worse. He would not let me face it alone. I felt something break inside me then, some tight knot of fear and shame that I had carried for so long. I stepped closer to him, close enough that I could see the weariness in his face, the lines of strain around his eyes, and I did something I had never done before. I reached out and touched his hand. Just that, my fingers resting lightly on his, a small gesture of gratitude and something else, something that might have been the beginning of genuine feeling. He did not pull away. His hand turned under mine, his fingers curling around my own, warm and steady. We stood like that in the dim entry hall, the gas lamps turned low, the house quiet around us, and for the first time since our marriage, I felt as though I was not alone, as though I had found someone who would stand beside me even when I did not deserve it. He said we should rest. Tomorrow would bring more challenges, more revelations, more difficult choices. But tonight, for a few hours, we could allow ourselves to be simply two people trying to navigate an impossible situation together. I nodded, and we climbed the stairs side by side, our footsteps echoing in the silence. When we reached my door, he paused, and for a moment I thought he might say something more, might cross some invisible boundary between duty and desire, between the marriage we had agreed to and the one we might yet become. But he only squeezed my hand gently and said goodnight, and I watched him walk down the hallway to his own chambers, feeling both disappointed and relieved. I lay in bed that night thinking about trust, about how it was built through small gestures and honest words, about how fragile it was and how difficult to repair once broken. I had lied to Nathaniel, had hidden the truth from him, but he had not abandoned me. He had chosen to help me despite my deception, had offered protection when he could have withdrawn it. That meant something. That meant everything. And I found myself hoping, desperately, foolishly, that when this was over, when the trial was concluded and James was found and the truth finally came to light, there might still be a chance for us. A chance to build something real from the ruins of our arranged marriage. A chance to earn back the trust I had squandered. A chance to become the wife he deserved rather than the one he had settled for. Outside, the fog began to lift, the first pale light of dawn breaking through the clouds. A new day was coming, bringing with it the possibility of revelation and redemption, of justice and mercy, of endings, and perhaps, if I was very lucky, a new beginning. I closed my eyes and let myself imagine it. A future where I did not have to hide, where I could stand beside Nathaniel without fear, where the past no longer held me captive. It seemed impossible, a dream too fragile to survive the harsh light of day. But for now, in the darkness before dawn, I let myself believe it might be possible. And that belief, however fragile, was enough to let me finally sleep. James Whitmore was found 3 days later in a boarding house near the docks in Limehouse, drunk and desperate, with a one-way passage to New York booked for the following morning. The constables who arrested him said he did not resist, simply sat on his narrow bed with his head in his hands and wept. They found the murder weapon hidden in his trunk, a knife with Ridley's blood still staining the handle. They found money, far more than a clerk should possess, wrapped in oilcloth and tucked beneath the mattress. And they found documents, dozens of them, stolen from Ridley's office during the murder. Marriage certificates, business contracts, letters that proved infidelity and fraud, all the secrets Ridley had kept for his clients. All the ammunition James had planned to use for blackmail. Among them was my marriage certificate. My name, my signature, the date that marked my greatest mistake. Nathaniel brought it to me himself, late one evening, entering my room without knocking, his face grave. He placed the document on my dressing table and stood back, watching as I picked it up with trembling hands. It was real, undeniable, proof that I had been married before, that I had lied not just to Nathaniel, but to everyone who knew me. I looked at it and felt nothing but weariness, a bone-deep exhaustion from months of fear and hiding. I asked Nathaniel what he intended to do with it. He was silent for a long moment. Then he crossed to the fireplace, took the certificate from my hands, and fed it to the flames. We watched together as the paper blackened and curled, as my past turned to ash and smoke. When it was gone, he turned to me and said that, as far as the law was concerned, that marriage had never existed. The only record had been held by Ridley and stolen by James. Now it was destroyed. I was Eleanor Corwin, wife of Judge Nathaniel Corwin, and nothing else. I asked him why. Why would he do this? Why would he destroy evidence? Why would he protect me after everything I had hidden from him? He said because he had made a promise to me, because he understood now what desperation could drive a person to do, and because he believed everyone deserved a chance to be more than their worst mistake. Even me. Especially me. I stood and went to him, and this time when I touched his hand, he did not simply accept it passively. He turned toward me, his hands finding my arms, his eyes searching my face with an intensity that made my breath catch. He said he had been alone for so long, had convinced himself he was content with solitude, with work, with the cold comfort of duty fulfilled. But these past weeks with me, even in the midst of lies and fear and scandal, had shown him something different. He had felt alive again, had felt purpose beyond the courtroom, had felt the possibility of connection with another human being. And he did not want to lose that. He did not want to lose me. I told him I did not deserve his forgiveness, did not deserve the protection he offered. I had lied to him, had put him in an impossible position, had risked his reputation and his career. But he said forgiveness was not about deserving. It was about choosing to see someone as they could be rather than as they were. And he chose to see me not as the frightened girl who had made a terrible mistake, but as the woman who was trying, however imperfectly, to become better. He kissed me then. Not formally, not the cold press of lips on my cheek as on our wedding day, but truly kissed me, his mouth warm and certain on mine, his arms pulling me close. And I kissed him back, pouring into it all the gratitude and relief and growing affection I had been too afraid to acknowledge. When we finally drew apart, both breathless, he rested his forehead against mine and said that perhaps we could start again. Properly this time, with honesty between us. I said yes. I said yes with all my heart. The trial resumed the following week. James Whitmore was charged with Thomas Ridley's murder, and the evidence against him was overwhelming. He confessed eventually in a rambling statement that laid bare his greed and desperation. He had gone to Ridley demanding the return of documents he had placed there, documents he now wanted to use for blackmail. Ridley had refused, had threatened to expose James's schemes to the police. They had argued, the argument had turned violent, and James had seized the letter opener from Ridley's desk and struck him. Once, then again, and then he could not stop. Afterwards, in panic, he had ransacked the office, searching for all the documents Ridley held, taking everything he could find, hoping to profit from them before fleeing the country. Robert Fletcher was released immediately, his name cleared, his conviction for embezzlement reopened for review. It emerged that Fletcher had been right all along, that his former employer had indeed framed him, and that Ridley had suppressed evidence that would have proven his innocence. Ridley, it seemed, had been paid by Fletcher's employer to ensure the conviction. Justice had been corrupted, and an innocent man had spent years in prison because of it. Nathaniel took Fletcher's case personally, working to overturn the embezzlement conviction and secure compensation for the years Fletcher had lost. It was the right thing to do, he said, and after everything that had happened, after all the lies and compromises, he needed to do something unambiguously right. I helped where I could, writing letters, making inquiries, using what small influence I had as a judge's wife to open doors that might otherwise have remained closed. It felt good to be useful, to be working towards something, just rather than simply hiding from the past. The scandal of James Whitmore's arrest and confession dominated the newspapers for weeks. The revelation that Thomas Ridley had been a blackmailer, that he had held secrets for dozens of prominent Londoners, sent shockwaves through society. Many of those documents James had stolen were eventually returned to their rightful owners, quietly, discreetly, by Nathaniel himself. He contacted each person, explained what had been recovered, and gave them the choice of whether to reclaim the documents or have them destroyed. Most chose destruction. Some secrets, Nathaniel said, were better left buried. Mine among them. No one ever knew about the marriage certificate, about my connection to James Whitmore or Thomas Ridley. Nathaniel had protected me completely, and in doing so had given me a gift more valuable than I could have imagined. Not just the preservation of my reputation, but the freedom to move forward without the weight of the past crushing me. My family never learned how close we had come to ruin. My father, relieved that the crisis he had feared never materialized, gradually relaxed his vigilance. My mother resumed her social activities, her calling cards, her endless attention to propriety. And Catherine, my sweet sister, became engaged to a young doctor with kind eyes and a gentle manner. I attended her engagement party at our parents' home, standing beside Nathaniel, watching Catherine dance with her fiancé, and felt a bittersweet mixture of relief and regret. Relief that she would never know what I had gone through to protect her future. Regret that I could never tell her the truth, could never share with her the lessons I had learned about love and trust and the cost of deception. But Catherine was happy, radiantly so, and that was enough. I had done what I set out to do. I had protected her. And in the process, I had found something I had not been looking for. A partner. A true husband. A man who knew my worst secrets and chose to stand beside me anyway. Nathaniel and I grew closer in the months following the trial. Slowly, carefully, we learned to trust each other, to speak honestly about our fears and hopes, to build the kind of marriage neither of us had expected when we first agreed to our arrangement. He told me about his first wife, about the grief he had carried for so long, about how he had buried himself in work to avoid feeling anything at all. I told him about my loneliness growing up, about the pressure to be perfect, about how I had been so desperate for affection that I had fallen for the first man who showed me attention, no matter how false that attention proved to be. We were both damaged, both carrying wounds that had not healed properly. But together, we began to heal each other. He moved his things into the room adjoining mine, and we began taking breakfast together every morning, talking about our plans for the day, sharing small observations and private jokes. He brought me books from his library, volumes of philosophy and law that he thought I might find interesting, and I surprised him by not only reading them, but debating the ideas they contained. He had not expected me to have opinions about justice and ethics and the role of law in society, but I did, and he listened to them with genuine interest, sometimes conceding points, sometimes arguing back, always treating me as an intellectual equal. We walked together in the square's garden on fine afternoons, his hand resting at the small of my back, a gesture of intimacy that would have been impossible months before. We attended dinners and theater performances, presenting ourselves as a properly married couple, and gradually it stopped being a performance. The affection became real, the partnership became genuine, and somewhere in the midst of all that careful rebuilding, I realized I loved him. Not with the desperate, foolish passion I had felt for James, but with something deeper, steadier, more enduring. I loved him for his integrity, for his kindness, for the way he had chosen mercy over judgment when he could easily have condemned me. I told him this one evening as we sat together in his study, he reviewing case notes while I worked on correspondence. The words simply emerged, unbidden, honest. I love you. He looked up from his papers, surprise and something like joy flickering across his face, and he set his work aside and came to where I sat. He knelt beside my chair, took my hands in his, and said he loved me too, had been falling in love with me slowly since the day I had finally trusted him with the truth. He had seen my courage then, he said, my willingness to face consequences rather than let an innocent man suffer. That was when he had known I was worth fighting for. Our marriage became real that night, in every sense. No longer an arrangement of convenience, but a true union, built on honesty and trust and genuine affection. And I discovered that intimacy with someone you loved, someone who loved you back, was nothing like what I had experienced before. It was tender and passionate and affirming, a joining of not just bodies, but souls. And when I woke the next morning in his arms, I felt more at peace than I had in years. The months passed, winter gave way to spring, and London shook off its gray mantle and bloomed. The gardens in our square filled with flowers, children played beneath the trees, and light streamed through our windows in a way it never had before. I redecorated some of the rooms, bringing color and warmth into spaces that had been cold and austere, and Nathaniel not only approved but helped, offering opinions about fabrics and furnishings with an enthusiasm that surprised us both. We hosted our first dinner party as a proper married couple, inviting Nathaniel's colleagues and their wives, and I played the role of hostess with a confidence I had not possessed before. I was no longer hiding, no longer afraid. I was Eleanor Corwin, wife of Judge Nathaniel Corwin, and I belonged exactly where I was. Robert Fletcher came to visit us one afternoon in May. He had been fully exonerated, his conviction overturned, and he was rebuilding his life with the compensation he had received. He wanted to thank Nathaniel personally for believing in his innocence, for fighting for him when no one else would. They spoke for an hour in Nathaniel's study, and when Fletcher left, I saw tears in his eyes. Gratitude, relief, the overwhelming emotion of a man who had been given back his life. After he was gone, Nathaniel sat for a long time in silence, staring at nothing. I asked him what he was thinking. He said he was thinking about justice, about how fragile it was, how easily it could be corrupted or manipulated, how important it was that someone stand guard over it. He had always believed in the law, he said, believed it was the foundation of civilization, the thing that separated order from chaos. But he understood now that law without mercy, without understanding of human weakness and capacity for redemption, was just another form of tyranny. I told him he was a good man, a just man, and that I was grateful every day that he had given me a chance to prove I could be better than my worst mistake. He said we all deserved that chance, all of us who had stumbled and fallen and were trying to rise again. That was what justice truly meant, not punishment, but the possibility of restoration, of becoming whole again. That summer, we traveled to the coast, to a small village in Cornwall where Nathaniel had spent summers as a child. We stayed in a cottage overlooking the sea, and for 2 weeks we were simply ourselves, without the weight of duty or reputation or the past pressing down on us. We walked on the beach, climbed the cliffs, read books in the garden, and talked late into the night about everything and nothing. It was the happiest I had ever been. On our last evening there, we stood on the cliff watching the sun set over the water, the sky turning gold and red and purple. And Nathaniel put his arms around me from behind, his chin resting on my shoulder. He said he was glad I had answered his door that day, glad I had agreed to marry him, glad that circumstances had brought us together, even if the circumstances themselves had been painful. He said he could not imagine his life without me now, could not imagine going back to the cold, lonely existence he had known before. I leaned back against him and said I felt the same. I had married him to bury a scandal, to escape the consequences of my mistakes. But I had found something far more valuable than safety or respectability. I had found love. Real love. The kind that saw all your flaws and loved you anyway. The kind that made you want to be better, not out of fear but out of gratitude. The kind that healed old wounds and created new possibilities. The past would always be part of me, I knew that. The mistakes I had made, the lies I had told, the fear I had carried. But they no longer defined me. I had been given a second chance, and I was determined not to waste it. I would be the wife Nathaniel deserved. I would be honest and brave and worthy of the trust he had placed in me. And I would spend the rest of my life proving that redemption was possible, that people could change, that love could transform even the most broken among us into something whole. We returned to London at summer's end, to our house on Grosvenor Square, to our life together. The scandal of Thomas Ridley's murder had faded from the newspapers, replaced by newer outrages and sensations. James Whitmore had been tried, convicted, and hanged, his death a footnote in the larger story of justice slowly, imperfectly being served. The evidence box had been sealed and stored away, its contents no longer needed, no longer relevant to anyone's life but ours. And my ring, the one Nathaniel had placed on my finger on our wedding day, remained where it belonged, on my hand. A symbol not of imprisonment or obligation, but of choice, of commitment freely given, of a future built on honesty and trust. I wore it proudly, and every time I looked at it, I remembered not the fear I had felt when I first accepted it, but the moment Nathaniel had knelt beside my chair and told me he loved me. The moment he had chosen to see me as I could be, rather than as I had been. The moment I had finally learned what it meant to be truly married. Not bound by law or necessity, but joined by love and mutual respect, and the shared understanding that we were both imperfect, both struggling, both trying to be better than we were. That was what saved us both in the end. Not the destruction of evidence or the exposure of truth, but the simple recognition that everyone deserves mercy. Everyone deserves a second chance. Everyone deserves to be loved despite their flaws. I married a judge to bury a scandal, but I found a husband who taught me that justice and mercy were not opposites but partners, that the law existed not to punish, but to protect, and that redemption was always possible for those brave enough to seek it. The evidence box revealed my wedding ring and nearly destroyed me. But it also revealed the man I had married, his capacity for compassion, his willingness to forgive, his understanding that the past did not have to determine the future. We built a life together from the ruins of an arrangement, a real marriage from the ashes of convenience. And if that is not justice, if that is not mercy, if that is not love in its truest form, then I do not know what is. The rain falls on London still, washing the streets clean, carrying away the debris of each day. But inside our house on Grosvenor Square, there is light and warmth and the quiet certainty that we are exactly where we belong. Together, honest, free at last from the secrets that once threatened to destroy us. And every morning when I wake beside my husband, I give thanks for the scandal that brought us together, for the trial that tested us, for the evidence that revealed us, and for the love that saved us both. That is how this story ends, not with judgment or condemnation, but with grace, not with punishment, but with redemption, not with fear, but with hope. And that, I have learned, is the only ending worth having.